it's quite clear that our call was part of a larger pressure for the IMF to do something with SDRs, which, I mean, as we've discussed already, is a potential mechanism to address liquidity constraints in the global economy. But for us, the number of 3 trillion really relates to the fact that we see the impact on developing countries of this kind of cascade of crises as being really rather enormous. So there's been this COVID crisis, which has really diverted a huge amount of potential fiscal space into emergency social and economic support. We are starting to, as I've mentioned before, this measuring a development finance gap, which is not just based on the SDGs, although of course those are crucial because they encapsulate what we would like to see as the transformation of economies, but also debt repayment, dealing with external flows, and then macroeconomic risks. And at the end of 2021, we estimated this risk now to be around about 10 trillion US dollars per year. So we see that as something that is, huge in the economy. And that, of course, is now being compounded by the armed conflict in Ukraine. And for us, when we see, and Marie-Louise covered this very nicely, we could see that countries are using their SDRs in a way that's almost unprecedented. But it's important to bear in mind, to your point, as to the size of these SDRs, is that when you look at the countries that are spending at least 20% of their government revenue on servicing external debt, just external debt, such as Angola and Gabon and Ghana and Somalia and the Maldives and Tunisia and Mozambique and the Congo and Senegal, you can actually see that on average, their servicing, their PPG, their public and private government external debt is twice their SDR allocation. So it gives you a sense of how, in fact, it was a welcome respite, but certainly not enough. And in that context, this idea that there should be 100 billion rechanneled, of course, is very welcome because, as Marie-Louise has pointed out, only 33 billion made it to Africa. So doubling the amount that goes to LICS and MICS would, of course, be very, very welcome. The problem is with that, of course, is that it's been a very slow process. And, of course, the key thing that we are concerned about is that the rechanneling process through the IMF trusts undoes some of the key distinguishing features of SDRs. SDRs are allocated to members free of debt and free of policy conditionality. However, once they are rechanneled via an IMF vehicle, they then are debt. And it might be debt at a low interest, but it's still debt. And of course, they also attract policy conditionality. So those are concerns that we have about how they should go, how they should be rechanneled. And so, yes, there are alternatives through the MDBs, which we think need to be really much more thoroughly explored. And we also feel that there is space for the kinds of proposal that's been made by Miyamoto of Barbados, which is that there should be an annual issuance of SDRs to deal with climate and SDGs. Now, the other thing is that I think we can see this claim or requirement for SDRs as really in the relative context of saying that even the UN now is saying that in order to achieve the SDGs, we may have to institute another program of debt forgiveness. And as an alternative to that, should we not rather be issuing another allocation of SDRs? Your comment, just very briefly, you've asked me to be brief about this Global Debt Authority. For us, the idea of the Global Debt Authority is to acknowledge the deficit of a systemic mechanism by which debt is dealt with in the international system. And so we have this piecemeal approach. We have rules for official creditors. We don't have the same rules for private creditors. And We have a complexity that has to be negotiated by the country that is at its weakest at the time that it's negotiating. And so we feel very strongly that something needs to be done about it. At the very least, we are calling urgently for a UN commission that would engage with really pulling together what the key makeup would be of this global debt authority.
We call for policies and practices that put people first. We call for policies and practices that put people first. You and I are the people who hold our governments to account. You and I are the people who hold our governments